The blood-red sun set over Muskogee, Oklahoma Territory, 1882, as Nora Turner frantically tried to pull her wrists free from the rope binding her to the wooden chair in Silas Warner's office. Her heart pounded against her ribs like a wild Mustang trying to break free from its corral. She'd made a terrible mistake signing that contract, but desperation had clouded her judgment 3 months ago when her father died, leaving her with nothing but debts and a small plot of barren land. "You ain't going nowhere, Miss Turner," Silas said, his voice slick as snake oil as he paced around her. "That contract is ironclad. You work for me until your daddy's debt is paid, and I say when that is." His fat fingers traced the line of her jaw. "And business ain't been good lately, so looks like you'll be with me for a long, long time." Nora jerked away from his touch. "I never agreed to this. I thought I'd be working as your housekeeper, not—" She choked on the words. "The details are in the fine print, darlin'." Silas smirked, pulling the contract from his desk drawer. "See here. Your services are at my discretion, and I got plenty of discretion." His laughter filled the room as he tucked the paper away. "Tomorrow night you'll be entertaining some very important gentlemen at my saloon. Wear that red dress I bought you." Tears stung Nora's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. At 22, she'd learned that crying never solved anything. "I won't do it." The back of Silas's hand connected with her cheek, the force snapping her head to the side. "You will. Unless you want to find yourself in a shallow grave like that Jenkins girl who tried to run." He leaned down, his whiskey-soured breath hot against her face. "No one will miss you, Nora. No one's coming to save you." As Silas's footsteps retreated and the door slammed shut, Nora slumped in the chair. He was right. There was no one left to care what happened to her. Her mother had died years ago, and her father had gambled away their ranch before his heart gave out. She had no siblings, no friends close enough to intervene. She worked at the ropes again, ignoring the way they burned her skin. If no one was coming to save her, she'd have to save herself. The door creaked open and Nora froze. "Had Silas returned, miss?" a quiet voice whispered. It was Betty, the cook's assistant, a girl barely 16. "Miss Turner, I brought you water." She slipped inside, a tin cup clutched in her trembling hands. "Betty, please help me," Nora pleaded. "Untie me." The girl's eyes widened with fear. "I can't, miss. Mr. Warner would kill me. He killed Maggie Jenkins last month when she tried to escape." So it was true. Nora had heard rumors about the missing girl but had prayed they weren't true. "Then get help, please." Who would help against Mr. Warner? He owns half the businesses in town and the sheriff's in his pocket. Betty set down the cup and backed toward the door. "I'm sorry, miss. I truly am." After Betty left, Nora struggled until her wrists were raw and bleeding. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, and she drifted into a fitful sleep filled with nightmares of what awaited her the following evening. She awoke to the sound of raised voices from the saloon below. Silas's office was on the second floor of the Red Garter, the saloon he owned where Nora had been forced to work serving drinks for the past 3 months. But tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow she would be expected to do much more than serve whiskey. "I said the girl ain't for sale." Silas's voice carried through the floorboards. "Everything has a price," replied a deep, unfamiliar voice. "Name yours." Nora strained to hear more, but their voices lowered. She wondered what poor woman they were discussing. Perhaps one of the other girls who worked downstairs, dressed in their gaudy outfits, laughing too loudly at men's jokes. The sound of boots on the stairs sent a fresh wave of panic through her. The door opened, and Silas entered, followed by a tall stranger whose face was shadowed by his wide-brimmed hat. Well, Sleeping Beauty's awake," Silas sneered. "Got someone here mighty interested in meeting you." The stranger stepped forward, pushing his hat back to reveal his face. He was younger than Nora had expected, perhaps in his late 20s. Dust from the trail clung to his dark denim pants and leather vest, but there was nothing rough about his appearance. His eyes, a startling shade of green, locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Miss Turner," the stranger said, tipping his hat slightly. "Grant Caldwell, I've just purchased your contract from Mr. Warner here." Nora's mind reeled. "Purchased?" She glared at Silas. "So I'm to be sold like cattle now?" Silas's face reddened. "Watch your mouth, girl. You're lucky Mr. Caldwell here is willing to take on your daddy's debt. Otherwise, you'd be downstairs tomorrow night, earning your keep the hard way." The stranger Grant stepped between them, his broad shoulders blocking Silas from Nora's view. "That's enough. The transaction is complete. I'll take Miss Turner now." "She's all yours," Silas said with a dismissive wave. "Don't come crying to me when you find out what a wildcat she is." He pulled a folded document from his pocket and thrust it at Grant. "Her contract, signed and legal." Grant took the paper without looking at it, his eyes still on Nora. "Untie her." Silas hesitated, then moved behind the chair to loosen the ropes. As soon as her hands were free, Nora rubbed her raw wrists, wincing at the pain. "Get your things," Grant said. His voice was firm but not unkind. "I don't have much," Nora admitted, rising unsteadily to her feet. Her legs had gone numb from sitting for so long. "Whatever you have, then. We're leaving town tonight." Nora wanted to protest, to demand explanations, but the alternative was staying with Silas. She hurried to the small room at the end of the hall where she'd been sleeping, grabbed her worn carpetbag, and stuffed her meager belongings inside 2 dresses, a hairbrush, a faded photograph of her parents, and her mother's silver locket, the one thing she'd refused to let Silas take. When she returned, Grant was waiting alone. "Where's Silas?" "Downstairs, counting his money." Grant's mouth twisted with disgust. "Are you ready?" Nora nodded, though ready for what, she wasn't sure. She followed him down the back stairs and out to the alley where a chestnut mare and a dark bay gelding waited. The night air was cool on her face after the stuffy confines of the office. Grant secured her bag to the mare's saddle. "Can you ride?" "Yes," Nora said, relieved to have one skill that might prove useful. "My father taught me." He nodded approvingly and helped her mount, his hands respectfully at her waist. Then he swung onto his own horse with the easy grace of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. They rode in silence through the sleeping town, past dark storefronts and houses with their windows glowing warmly from within. Nora felt the curious eyes of night owls watching their departure, but no one called out or tried to stop them. When they reached the edge of town, Grant finally spoke. "We'll ride for another hour or so, then make camp. There's a creek about 5 miles ahead with good shelter." "Where are we going?" Nora asked, unable to contain her questions any longer. "My ranch. It's 3 days' ride from here, near Fort Gibson." "And what will I be doing there?" She braced herself for his answer, fearing the worst. Grant glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. "That's for you to decide." "I don't understand." He sighed, adjusting his hat. "Miss Turner, I bought your contract to give you your freedom, not to own you. When we reach my ranch, you can stay and work paid work. Mind you, or I can provide you with enough money to go wherever you wish." Nora stared at him, stunned. Why would you do that for a stranger? He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "Let's just say I've seen what men like Warner do to women with no choices. I couldn't stand by and watch it happen again." There was pain in his voice, a history he wasn't sharing. Nora wanted to press for more, but something in his demeanor warned her not to. Instead, she said, "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell." "Grant," he corrected. "If we're going to be traveling together, you might as well use my given name. Then you must call me Nora." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Nora it is." They rode on through the night, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional call of a night bird the only sounds. For the first time in months, Nora felt something other than fear and despair. It wasn't quite hope, she didn't trust that yet, but it was something close to it. When they reached the creek, Grant helped her dismount. Her legs were stiff from riding and she stumbled slightly as her feet hit the ground. His hands steadied her, strong and sure, but he released her as soon as she found her balance. "I'll see to the horses," he said. "There's jerky and biscuits in my saddlebag if you're hungry." Nora nodded, grateful for his consideration. She found a fallen log near where he'd indicated they would camp and sat down, watching as he expertly unsaddled the horses and led them to the creek to drink. There was an economy to his movements, a quiet competence that spoke of years of self-reliance. While he worked, she studied him more closely. He was tall, with broad shoulders tapering to a narrow waist. His hair, visible when he removed his hat, was dark brown with hints of copper where the moonlight caught it. His face was handsome in a weathered way, strong jaw, straight nose, eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. When he returned with the saddlebags, he caught her watching him. A faint flush colored her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "Hungry?" he asked, offering her a piece of jerky and a biscuit. She accepted them gratefully, suddenly aware of how long it had been since she'd eaten. They sat in companionable silence as they ate, the night sounds creating a peaceful backdrop. "Why were you in Muskogee?" she asked finally. "It's not exactly on the way to anywhere." Grant took a sip from his canteen before answering. "I had business with a horse trader there. Heard about your situation from the bartender at the hotel, and you just decided to buy me." Nora couldn't keep the edge from her voice. "I decided to give you a choice." His eyes met hers steadily, something Warner never would have done. "How do you know about men like him?" Grant's jaw tightened. "My sister," he said after a moment. "She got caught in a similar situation in Dodge City by the time I found her." He trailed off, the memory clearly painful. "I was too late." "I'm sorry," Nora said softly, understanding now his motivation. "What was her name?" "Grace." His voice was barely audible. "She was 18. Nora wanted to reach out to him to offer some comfort, but she sensed he wouldn't welcome it. Instead, she said, "Thank you for not being too late for me." He nodded, his expression softening slightly. "You should get some rest. We have a long ride ahead of us tomorrow." Grant spread a bedroll for her near the fire he'd built, then moved to the other side and laid out his own. As Nora settled onto the rough blanket, she watched the stars overhead, brighter and more numerous than they'd seemed from her window in town. "Grant," she called softly. "Yes. What kind of work would I do, at your ranch, I mean?" He propped himself up on one elbow. "My housekeeper left last month to get married. I need someone to cook and clean, keep things in order. It's hard work, but it's honest." Nora nodded, considering. It sounded like the kind of work she'd done for her father before everything fell apart. "I'll think about it." "Take your time. Like I said, it's your choice." As Nora drifted toward sleep, that word echoed in her mind. Choice. Such a small word for such a precious thing. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Nora woke to find Grant already up, tending the horses and brewing coffee over a small fire. He handed her a tin cup without a word, and she accepted it gratefully, savoring the bitter warmth. "We should reach the trading post at Choctaw Creek by nightfall," he said as he packed up their camp. "There's a widow there who rents rooms. We can get a proper meal and a night's sleep before the last stretch." Nora nodded, relief washing over her at the thought of a real bed. They rode steadily through the day, stopping occasionally to rest the horses and eat. Grant wasn't much for conversation, but the silence between them was comfortable rather than strained. As they traveled, the landscape changed, becoming more rugged and wooded. They passed small farms and the occasional homestead, but for the most part the land remained wild and untamed. "Is your ranch large?" Nora asked as they rode side by side along a well-worn trail. "Large enough," Grant replied. 200 acres, good grassland for the cattle, some timber. There's a creek that runs year-round. And you manage it alone?" "I have 3 ranch hands who help with the cattle and horses. Good men. They live in the bunkhouse near the main house." Nora tried to picture it a proper ranch with a main house, not the small, struggling farm her father had barely maintained. "It sounds lovely." "It's home," Grant said simply, but there was pride in his voice. By the time they reached Choctaw Creek, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The trading post was little more than a collection of buildings clustered around a dusty square, but after a day in the saddle, it looked like paradise to Nora. The widow's house was a neat, whitewashed structure at the edge of the settlement. Mrs. Peterson, a stout woman with kind eyes and graying hair, greeted them warmly. "Mr. Caldwell, it's been too long since you've passed this way," she said, ushering them inside. "And you've brought a guest." Her eyes swept over Nora with frank curiosity. "Mrs. Peterson, this is Miss Nora Turner. We'd like 2 rooms for the night if you have them." Of course. Supper's almost ready, venison stew and cornbread. You 2 wash up and I'll have it on the table in no time." Mrs. Peterson showed Nora to a small but clean room at the back of the house. There was a basin of water on the dresser and a soft-looking bed that made Nora want to weep with gratitude. "Your young man seems the quiet sort," Mrs. Peterson remarked as she laid out a fresh towel. "He's not my young man," Nora corrected quickly. "He's helping me." Mrs. Peterson raised an eyebrow but didn't press. "Well, helping or courting, he's a good one. Known him since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. His father was one of the first settlers in these parts." After the older woman left, Nora washed the trail dust from her face and hands and changed into her cleanest dress. It was faded and a bit too large. It had been her mother's, but it was the best she had. When she joined Grant and Mrs. Peterson in the dining room, she found another guest already seated at the table, a young man with spectacles who was introduced as the new schoolteacher, Mr. Ellis. The conversation over dinner was lively, with Mrs. Peterson and Mr. Ellis carrying most of it. Grant ate quietly, contributing only when directly addressed, while Nora found herself drawn into discussions about the latest books Mr. Ellis had ordered for his students and Mrs. Peterson's remedies for various ailments. "And what brings you 2 through Choctaw Creek?" Mr. Ellis asked eventually. "Are you newly wed?" Nora choked on her water and Grant's expression froze mid-bite. "No," they said in unison, then glanced at each other awkwardly. "Miss Turner is considering a position as my housekeeper," Grant explained, setting down his fork. "Ah, I see." Mr. Ellis nodded, though his eyes darted between them with renewed interest. After dinner, Grant excused himself to check on the horses, and Nora retreated to the small parlor with Mrs. Peterson while Mr. Ellis retired to his room with a book. "So, a housekeeper, is it?" Mrs. Peterson asked as she settled into a rocking chair with her knitting. Nora nodded, focusing on the fire crackling in the hearth. "Yes, though I haven't decided for certain yet. Grant Caldwell's a good employer by all accounts, pays fair, treats his workers with respect." The older woman's needles clicked rhythmically. "But it's a lonely life out there for a young woman. His ranch is a good 10 miles from the nearest neighbor." "I'm used to being alone," Nora said softly. Mrs. Peterson studied her for a moment. "There's alone and then there's lonely, my dear. They're not the same thing." She set her knitting aside. "What's your story, if you don't mind my asking? Not many young ladies travel these parts without family." Nora hesitated, unsure how much to share, but there was something in the older woman's manner that invited confidence. "My father died 3 months ago, leaving debts. I signed a contract with a man in Muskogee, thinking I'd work as his housekeeper to pay off what was owed. It turned out he had other plans for me." Mrs. Peterson's expression darkened. "Silas Warner." Nora looked up, surprised. "You know him?" "Know of him," the widow corrected grimly. "His reputation travels. You're not the first girl he's tricked with those contracts of his." She picked up her knitting again, her movements more forceful now. "And Grant rescued you from this situation." "He bought my contract," Nora admitted. "But he says I'm free to choose what I do next." "That sounds like Grant." Mrs. Peterson nodded approvingly. "His father raised him right before the fever took him and his wife both." The front door opened, and Grant stepped inside, bringing a gust of cool night air with him. He nodded to the women as he removed his hat. "Horses are settled for the night. We should be able to make good time tomorrow." "Sit with us a while, Grant," Mrs. Peterson urged, gesturing to an empty chair. "I was just telling Miss Turner about the spring dance in Fort Gibson next month. You should bring her, let her meet some of the local folks." Grant's expression was unreadable as he took the offered seat. "If she decides to stay, that would be up to her." Of course, Mrs. Peterson agreed, but there was a gleam in her eye that made Nora suspect the older woman was playing matchmaker. They talked a while longer with Mrs. Peterson doing most of the talking, sharing news of births and marriages, the price of cattle, and the railroad that was rumored to be coming through in the next year or two. Eventually, Nora found herself stifling yawns. "I should turn in," she said, rising from her chair. "Thank you for the lovely evening, Mrs. Peterson." "Sleep well, dear," the widow replied warmly. Grant stood as Nora did. "We'll leave at first light if that suits you." "It does," Nora agreed. As she lay in bed that night, listening to the unfamiliar creaks and settling of the house, Nora found her thoughts turning to Grant. He was a puzzle reserved to the point of remoteness one moment, unexpectedly kind the next. What would life be like, working in his home? Would they become friends over time, or would he always keep that careful distance? More importantly, was staying with him the right choice? He'd offered her money to go elsewhere, start fresh. But where would she go? She had no family, no close friends. At least at Grant's ranch, she would have honest work and a roof over her head. She fell asleep still weighing her options, the rhythm of Mrs. Peterson's rocking chair from the parlor below lulling her into dreams. The next morning brought gray skies and the threat of rain. They departed early after a hearty breakfast of eggs, bacon, and biscuits prepared by Mrs. Peterson. "You come back and visit here," the widow said as she pressed a small package of food into Nora's hands. "And you," she added, turning to Grant, "don't be a stranger. 10 months is too long between visits." He tipped his hat to her, a small smile softening his features. "Yes, madam." They had been riding for about an hour when the first raindrops began to fall. Grant glanced at the darkening sky with concern. "There's a line shack about 3 miles ahead," he said. "We can wait out the worst of it there." The rain came harder, and by the time they reached the small wooden structure, they were both soaked through. The shack was simple, one room with a stone fireplace, a rough table with 2 chairs, and a narrow cot pushed against the far wall. Grant busied himself starting a fire while Nora stood awkwardly by the door, water dripping from her clothes onto the dirt floor. "There's a trunk in the corner with some dry clothes," Grant said without looking up from the kindling he was arranging. "They'll be too big, but they're clean. I'll step outside while you change." True to his word, he left as soon as the fire was going, closing the door firmly behind him. Nora found the trunk and opened it to discover several shirts, a pair of trousers, and some woolen socks. She selected a faded blue shirt that looked to be the smallest of the lot and changed quickly, rolling up the sleeves and using a piece of rope from the trunk as a belt to keep the shirt from completely swallowing her. The garment hung to her knees, making a makeshift dress. When she opened the door to call Grant back inside, she found him tending to the horses under a crude lean-to attached to the side of the shack. Rain plastered his shirt to his back, outlining the muscular contours of his shoulders. "You can come in now," she called over the sound of the rain. "You need to get dry, too." He nodded and led the horses further under the shelter before joining her inside. The fire had begun to warm the small space, casting flickering light across the walls. "I found some coffee and beans in the supplies," Nora said, gesturing to the items she'd set on the table. "And Mrs. Peterson's package has bread and cheese." "Good." Grant ran a hand through his wet hair, sending droplets flying. "We might be here a while. That's no spring shower out there." He took clean clothes from the trunk and stepped back outside briefly to change. When he returned, he had hung his wet clothes under the lean-to and was wearing dry trousers and a white shirt, unbuttoned at the collar. They worked together quietly, Nora preparing a simple meal while Grant built up the fire and checked for any leaks in the roof. The domesticity of it struck Nora as strange, given they were virtually strangers, yet there was a comfortable rhythm to their movements, as though they'd done this dance before. "How did you learn to cook?" Grant asked as they sat at the table, sharing the bread, cheese, and beans Nora had warmed over the fire. "My mother taught me before she died. I was 12. Nora tore a piece of bread in half. After that, I did all the cooking for my father and me." "You were young to take on such responsibility." She shrugged. "Many girls do the same. What about you? Who taught you to ride and ranch?" "My father. He came out here in '58 before the war, built the ranch from nothing." Pride colored his voice. "He taught me everything I know about cattle, horses, the land." "And your mother?" Nora asked gently. "She taught me to read, to cipher. She had been a schoolteacher back east before she married my father." A sad smile touched his lips. "She never quite adapted to frontier life, but she loved my father enough to try." "When did you lose them?" 10 years ago. "Cholera took them both within a week of each other. I was 18. Nora's heart ached for him. "So you've been running the ranch alone since then?" He nodded. "It hasn't been easy, but it's a good life." He glanced at her across the table. "It could be a good life for you too if you wanted it." The implication in his words that she might find more than just employment at his ranch hung in the air between them. Nora looked away, suddenly conscious of how intimate the small space felt with rain drumming on the roof and firelight dancing across his features. "Tell me about it," she said. "Your daily life, I mean." Grant seemed relieved by the shift to safer ground. "I rise before dawn, check on the animals. The ranch hands Thomas, Illy, and Joe handle most of the cattle work. I break horses, negotiate sales, keep the books." He took a sip of coffee. "The main house has 6 rooms. It's not grand, but it's solid. My mother planted a garden that still produces vegetables in season." As he spoke, Nora could almost see at the house with its garden, the corral where he broke horses, the pastures where cattle grazed. It sounded peaceful, orderly. The kind of life she might have had if her father hadn't gambled away their farm. "And what would my duties be? Specifically, I mean." "Cooking, cleaning, keeping the house in order, tending the garden if you've a mind to." He hesitated. "I've been doing those things myself since Mrs. Fletcher left, but I'm no hand at cooking and the house shows it." Nora smiled at his admission. "I'm a fair cook and I've kept house before." "I could manage that. You'd have your own room, of course. The back bedroom overlooks the creek. It gets good morning light." He seemed eager for her to see the appeal. "And Sundays would be yours to do as you please." It sounds more than fair, Nora admitted. The rain was letting up, she noticed, transitioning from a downpour to a gentle patter. Grant stood and moved to the window, pushing aside the rough burlap that served as a curtain. We might be able to continue on soon. It's clearing to the west. Nora joined him at the window. The sky was indeed lightening in the distance, though rain still fell steadily around the shack. Standing beside him, she was acutely aware of his height, the clean scent of him despite their travel-worn state. "How much farther to your ranch?" she asked, her voice softer than she'd intended. "About 15 miles. We could make it by nightfall if the weather holds." Their eyes met, and for a moment something passed between them, an awareness, a possibility. Then Grant stepped back, the moment broken. "We should pack up," he said, turning toward the table. Nora nodded, moving to gather their few supplies. But as she worked, she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. For the first time since her father's death, she was beginning to feel like she might have a future worth looking forward to. The rain stopped completely as they were preparing to leave. Grant doused the fire and secured the shack, while Nora changed back into her now dry clothes and saddled the mare with Grant's guidance. Her fingers fumbled a bit with the unfamiliar tack, but he was patient, showing her the proper way to tighten the cinch and position the saddle blanket. "You're a quick learner," he observed as she successfully adjusted the stirrups to her height. "I've always had to be," she replied, accepting his compliment with a small smile. The trail was muddy from the rain, forcing them to ride at a slower pace than the day before. The landscape had changed again, with more hills and stands of oak and hickory trees. Wildflowers dotted the meadows they passed, their bright colors a stark contrast to the gray sky. "Is all this your land?" Nora asked as they crested a particularly scenic rise that revealed a valley below, a silver ribbon of creek winding through it. "Not yet," Grant said with a chuckle. "But from that ridge there," he pointed to a distant line of hills, "everything to the east is Caldwell land." Pride resonated in his voice, and Nora found herself appreciating his connection to the place. Her family had moved too often for her to develop such roots, following her father's restless search for better opportunities that never seemed to materialize. As the afternoon progressed, the clouds dispersed completely, leaving a brilliant blue sky. The sun dried the mud on the trail, allowing them to increase their pace. Grant pointed out landmarks as they rode a lightning-struck oak that marked the boundary of his property, a rocky outcrop where mountain lions sometimes sunned themselves, the bend in the creek where he'd caught his first fish as a boy. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they rounded a curve in the trail, and Grant's ranch came into view. The main house stood on a gentle rise, a two-story structure built of sturdy logs with a wide porch wrapping around the front. A barn and several outbuildings clustered nearby, and beyond them, the bunkhouse where the ranch hands lived. Corrals held horses, and in the distance, cattle dotted the green pastures. "Welcome to the Circle C," Grant said, a note of quiet pride in his voice. Nora took it all in, her heart quickening. It was more impressive than she'd imagined, not opulent, but substantial, well-maintained, the mark of a man who took care of what was his. As they approached, a dog came bounding from the direction of the barn, barking joyously. Behind it, a tall, lean man with graying hair emerged, shading his eyes against the setting sun. "That's Thomas, my foreman," Grant explained. "Been with the ranch since my father's time." Thomas greeted them warmly as they dismounted in front of the barn. "Good to have you back, boss." "Everything's been quiet." His eyes moved curiously to Nora. "Madam," he said, tipping his hat. "Thomas, this is Miss Nora Turner," Grant said. "She may be taking over as housekeeper, "Pleased to meet you, Miss Turner. We sure could use a woman's touch around here. The boss burns water." Nora laughed, surprised by Thomas's easy manner. "So I've heard." "Where are Ellie and Joe?" Grant asked, handing Thomas the reins of his gelding. "Checking the north pasture fence. Should be back for supper." Thomas began unsaddling the horses. "Speaking of which, there's stew on the stove. Mrs. Peterson sent word you were on your way, so I put something on." Grant raised an eyebrow. "You cooked?" Thomas grinned. "Might not be fancy, but it's edible, unlike your attempts." The easy banter between them spoke of long friendship and mutual respect. Nora found herself smiling as she followed Grant toward the house, the dog trotting at their heels. "That's Rusty," Grant said, noticing her watching the animal. "He's supposed to be a cattle dog, but he's better at begging for scraps and sleeping on the porch." As if understanding, Rusty wagged his tail and nudged Nora's hand with his nose. She scratched him behind the ears, earning an appreciative whine. The front porch of the house was wide and inviting, with a swing at one end and several rocking chairs spaced along it. Grant opened the door and stepped back to let Nora enter first. The interior was simply furnished but clean and well-ordered. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, flanked by bookshelves filled with volumes that spoke of someone who valued reading. Comfortable chairs and a sofa were arranged to take advantage of both the fireplace and the windows that let in the evening light. A dining table with 6 chairs stood at the far end of the room, and beyond it, Nora could see a spacious kitchen. "It's lovely," she said honestly. Grant seemed pleased by her reaction. "Let me show you the rest." He led her through the house, pointing out the kitchen with its large cast-iron stove and well-stocked pantry, a small study off the main room where he kept the ranch accounts, and upstairs, 4 bedrooms his own at the front of the house, 2 unused guest rooms, and at the back, the room that would be hers if she stayed. As promised, the back bedroom had windows that overlooked the creek, now tinged gold in the evening light. The room itself was simply furnished with a bed, a dresser, and a small writing desk beneath one window. A colorful quilt covered the bed, its pattern complex and clearly handmade. "My mother made that," Grant said, following her gaze. "She was quite skilled with a needle." Nora touched the quilt gently. "It's beautiful." They stood in silence for a moment, the room growing dimmer as the sun continued its descent. Finally, Grant cleared his throat. "You must be tired after the journey. I'll let you get settled while I check on that stew Thomas mentioned." After he left, Nora set her carpetbag on the bed and slowly unpacked her few possessions. The dresser drawers were lined with paper that smelled faintly of lavender, and she found clean towels and a pitcher of water on the washstand. She changed into her other dress, faded blue calico, that had seen better days but was at least clean, and washed her face and hands. As she combed her hair, she studied her reflection in the small mirror hanging above the washstand. 3 months of worry and fear had left their mark. Her face was thinner, with shadows beneath her eyes that hadn't been there before. But already she thought she could see a difference, a lightening of the fear that had become so familiar. When she went downstairs, she found Grant in the kitchen, stirring a pot on the stove. He'd shed his trail coat and rolled up his sleeves, revealing strong forearms dusted with dark hair. "Can I help?" she asked from the doorway. He turned, a smile warming his features. "Just setting the table would be a start. Plates are in that cupboard there." They worked together companionably, Nora setting the table while Grant finished preparing the meal. Thomas's stew proved to be simple but tasty, with chunks of beef, potatoes, and carrots in a rich broth. There was fresh bread, too, which Grant explained had been baked by a neighbor's wife and brought over that morning. As they ate, Grant told her more about the ranch, the 100 head of cattle that grazed the western pastures, the dozen horses he was training for sale, his plans to expand the herd in the coming year. Nora listened, asking questions that revealed her interest and practical mind. "You know a fair bit about ranching," Grant observed as they were finishing their meal. "My father worked on several ranches over the years," Nora explained. "I listened and learned what I could. He wanted a son to pass his knowledge to, but he got me instead." "He was lucky to have you," Grant said quietly. Nora glanced up, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "That's kind of you to say." "It's the truth." He hesitated, then added, "I know we've only just met, but I can see you're a woman of intelligence and character. Any father would be proud." His words touched something deep inside her, a wound that had never properly healed. Her father had loved her, she knew, but he'd also resented her for not being the son he'd wanted, for reminding him too much of the wife he'd lost. She blinked back unexpected tears. "Thank you," she managed, focusing on her plate. After dinner, they sat on the porch, watching as twilight deepened into night. The first stars appeared, pinpricks of light in the darkening sky. Rusty lay at their feet, occasionally sighing contentedly. "Have you decided?" Grant asked finally, breaking the comfortable silence. "Whether you'll stay or move on." Nora had been pondering this very question all day. The ranch was everything Grant had described: peaceful, well-run, a place where she could see herself building a new life. And Grant himself had proven to be a good man, honorable, kind, with a quiet strength that was reassuring rather than intimidating. "I'd like to stay," she said. "At least for a time, if the offer still stands." Relief washed over his features. "It does. I'm glad." "I should warn you, I'm not much of a baker," she added with a small smile, "but I can learn." "I'm sure you can." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded document. "Before we go any further, though, there's something I want you to have." Nora recognized it immediately, the contract Silas had given him, the one that had bound her to a future of exploitation and abuse. Her throat tightened at the sight of it. Grant held it out to her. "This is yours now, to do with as you please." With trembling fingers, Nora took the paper. For a moment, she simply stared at it, thinking of all the fear and desperation that had led her to sign it in the first place. Then, deliberately, she tore it in half and then in quarters until it was nothing but confetti in her hands. Grant watched her, approval in his eyes. "I'd have done the same." Nora let the pieces flutter from her fingers, carried away by the gentle evening breeze. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not just for buying the contract, but for giving me the choice." "Everyone deserves that much," he replied simply. As they sat there, with night settling fully around them and the sounds of the ranch quieting, Nora felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time: peace. Not just the absence of fear, but a positive sensation of rightness, of being exactly where she was meant to be. Whether it would last, she couldn't say. But for now, it was enough. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity as Nora settled into her new role at the Circle C Ranch. Each day brought new challenges and discoveries, from learning the quirks of the massive cast iron stove to figuring out how to remove coffee stains from Grant's ledger books. She met the other ranch hands, a quiet young man with a gift for working with horses, and Joe, an older cowboy with a booming laugh and endless stories of the early days on the frontier. The men were respectful, if a bit awkward around her at first, clearly unused to having a woman in their midst. Grant himself maintained a polite distance. He was unfailingly kind, appreciative of her efforts to bring order to his home, but careful never to intrude on her privacy or make her uncomfortable. They shared meals and occasional conversations on the porch in the evenings, but he spent most of his days out on the ranch. returning only at dusk, often too tired for much beyond eating and a brief exchange about the day's events. Still, Nora found herself looking forward to those moments, watching the trail in the late afternoon for signs of his return. There was something about his steady presence that calmed her, made her feel safe in a way she hadn't since before her mother died. One evening, about a month after her arrival, Nora was preparing dinner when she heard a commotion outside, men shouting, horses neighing in distress. She rushed to the window to see Grant and Thomas half carrying, half dragging Ellie toward the house. She threw open the door as they reached the porch. "What happened?" "Horse threw him," Grant said tersely. "His leg's broken and he's got a nasty gash on his head." They maneuvered Ellie into the house and onto the sofa. The young man was pale, his face contorted with pain, blood matting his fair hair. "I'll get water and bandages," Nora said, already moving toward the kitchen. When she returned with a basin of water, clean cloths, and the small medical kit she'd found in a kitchen cupboard, Grant was cutting away Ellie's blood-soaked pant leg to reveal a jagged wound where the bone had broken through the skin. "Thomas has gone for the doctor," Grant told her, his face grim. "But Doc Porter's in Fort Gibson. It could be hours before he gets here." Nora assessed the situation quickly. The wound needed cleaning, the bleeding stopped, and the bone set if Ellie was to have any chance of keeping his leg. "I've helped with injuries before," she said, rolling up her sleeves. "On my father's farm and later at a cattle ranch where he worked." Grant looked at her searchingly, then nodded. "Tell me what you need." For the next hour they worked together to treat Ellie's injuries. Nora cleaned and bandaged the head wound, which looked worse than it was, while Grant prepared splints for the broken leg. Setting the bone was the hardest part. Ellie screamed despite the whiskey they'd given him, and it took both Grant and Joe to hold him down while Nora manipulated the bone back into place with steady hands that belied her racing heart. By the time they finished, Ellie had passed out from the pain and Nora was trembling with exhaustion. Grant led her to the kitchen, where he poured her a small glass of whiskey. "Drink," he said gently. "It will help with the shakes." She took a sip, grimacing at the burn. "Will he be all right?" "Thanks to you, I think so." Grant's voice was warm with admiration. "Where did you learn to set a bone like that?" "My father's leg was broken by a bull when I was 16. We were too far from town for a doctor, so the ranch foreman talked me through it." She shuddered at the memory. "I never wanted to do it again, but it seems life had other plans." Grant touched her arm lightly. "You were remarkable, Nora, truly." His praise warmed her more than the whiskey, and she found herself smiling despite her exhaustion. "We make a good team." "We do at that," he agreed, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than usual. The doctor arrived 2 hours later and confirmed what Nora already knew. Ellie's leg was broken in 2 places, but the bone had been set properly, and with time and care, he should recover. The head wound required a few stitches, but wasn't serious. "You've got yourself a fine nurse here, Caldwell," Doc Porter said as he packed up his bag. "Most ladies would have fainted at the sight of a compound fracture." "Miss Turner isn't most ladies," Grant replied, his gaze meeting Nora's across the room. After the doctor left, they moved Ellie to one of the downstairs guest rooms where he could be more easily tended. It was well past midnight by the time the house quieted. Nora, too wired to sleep despite her exhaustion, found herself back on the porch, breathing in the cool night air. She didn't hear Grant join her until he spoke. "You should be resting." "My mind won't settle," she admitted, turning to find him standing in the doorway, a blanket in his hands. He crossed to where she sat and draped the blanket around her shoulders. "The nights get cold, even in summer." The gesture was simple but thoughtful, like so many things he did. Nora pulled the blanket tighter, grateful for its warmth and for his consideration. "Thank you for your help today," he said, leaning against the porch railing. "Illy wouldn't have fared well without your skill." "I'm glad I could help. He seems like a good young man." "He is. Came to work for me 3 years ago, barely 18. His family lost their farm in the drought of '79. Grant stared out at the dark ranch yard. "He sends most of his wages back to his mother and sisters in Kansas." Nora's heart went out to the young cowboy. So many families struggled on the frontier, where one bad season could mean the difference between survival and ruin. "What will happen while his leg heals?" she asked. "Can you manage with one less hand?" Grant sighed. "It'll be tight, especially with Roundup coming, but we'll manage. Thomas and Joe will take on extra work, and I'll have to spend more time in the saddle than at my desk." "I could help," Nora offered before she'd fully considered the implications. "With the cattle, I mean." Grant turned to her, surprise evident in his expression. "You know how to work cattle. I can ride, and I've helped with Roundup before. I'm not claiming to be a cowhand, but I know the basics." He studied her face in the dim light from the window. "It's hard work, Nora. Long hours in the saddle, dust, heat." "I'm stronger than I look," she countered. "And I want to help. You've done so much for me, this is something I can do in return." A slow smile spread across his face. "You continue to surprise me, Miss Turner." "Is that a yes?" he chuckled. "It's a we'll see. Get some rest tonight and we'll talk about it in the morning." As he turned to go back inside, Nora called after him softly. "Grant," he paused, looking back at her. "I'm glad I stayed." In the shadows, she couldn't see his expression clearly, but his voice was warm when he replied. "So am I, Nora. So am I." True to his word, Grant considered her offer to help with the ranch work. After assessing her riding skills the next day, which, while rusty, proved serviceable, he agreed to let her assist with some of the lighter duties. Nora split her time between caring for Illy, maintaining the house, and helping on the ranch where she could. Grant found her an old pair of trousers that had belonged to his sister, along with a sturdy shirt and boots that were only slightly too large. The first time she appeared at the barn dressed for riding, he did a double take, his eyes widening before he quickly looked away. "Those, fit better than I expected," he said, busying himself with saddling a horse. Nora tugged self-consciously at the shirt, aware that the men's clothing revealed more of her figure than her usual dresses. "They'll do for riding. I wouldn't wear them to church." That earned her a laugh, and the moment of awkwardness passed. Over the next few weeks, they fell into a new routine. In the mornings, Nora would help with household chores and look in on Illy, whose recovery was progressing well. In the afternoons, she would ride out with Grant or one of the other men to check fences, move cattle, or deliver supplies to the more distant pastures. To her surprise, she enjoyed the ranch work immensely. There was a satisfaction in physical labor under the open sky that she hadn't experienced in her previous jobs. And the time spent with Grant, riding side by side across his land, allowed them to develop a deeper friendship than their evening conversations had permitted. He told her stories of growing up on the ranch, of his father's dreams for the land, his mother's determination to bring culture and education to the wilderness. In turn, she shared memories of her own childhood, the good times before her mother's death, and the harder years that followed. "My father wasn't always the way he was at the end," she told Grant one afternoon as they rode along the creek that marked the northern boundary of his property. "He was kind once, full of dreams, but losing my mother broke something in him. The drinking and gambling came later when the pain got to be too much." Grant nodded in understanding. "Grief can change a person. After my parents died, I nearly sold the ranch, couldn't bear the memories." "What stopped you?" He was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Responsibility at first. The men who worked for my father, they depended on this place for their livelihoods. And then, as time passed, I remembered why my father loved this land so much. Its beauty, its potential. He glanced at her. Now I can't imagine being anywhere else. Nora understood what he meant. In just a few short weeks, the Circle C had begun to feel like home in a way no place had since her childhood. As summer progressed into autumn, the relationship between Nora and Grant continued to deepen. They worked together during the day, shared meals and conversation in the evenings, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the careful distance Grant had maintained began to diminish. She noticed it in small ways: his hand lingering when he helped her mount her horse, the way his eyes followed her across a room, how he sought out her opinion on matters related to the ranch. For her part, Nora found herself looking forward to their time together with an eagerness that went beyond friendship. The change in their relationship didn't go unnoticed by the others on the ranch. Thomas, in particular, watched them with knowing eyes, occasionally hiding a smile behind his hand when they were together. Even Illy, still confined to the house but recovering well enough to sit on the porch most days, commented on it. "The boss is different around you," he told Nora one morning as she changed his bandages. "Happier. He used to be so serious all the time." Nora felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "We're friends, that's all," Illy grinned. "If you say so, Miss Turner." But friends don't look at each other the way you two do when you think no one's watching. She didn't know how to respond to that, so she busied herself with tidying up the medical supplies, her mind racing. Was it so obvious to everyone? And if it was, why hadn't Grant acted on whatever feelings he might have? He was a man of action, direct in his dealings. If he felt something beyond friendship, surely he would have said so. Unless, she realized with a start, he was waiting for some sign from her. After all, he had been scrupulously respectful of her choices from the beginning. Perhaps he feared that any declaration on his part would make her feel obligated, given the debt she owed him. The thought preoccupied her for the rest of the day as she went about her tasks. By evening, she had resolved to find a way to let Grant know that his feelings, if indeed he had them, would not be unwelcome. Her opportunity came later that night. After dinner, as was their custom, they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The evening was unusually warm for September, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of late-blooming wildflowers. "Mrs. Peterson sent word that the harvest dance is next Saturday," Grant said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "In Fort Gibson." Nora remembered the widow's mention of the dance months earlier. "Oh, will you be attending?" He hesitated, his fingers drumming lightly on the arm of his chair. "I thought we might go. Together, that is, if you'd like to." Her heart quickened at the invitation. "I'd like that very much." Grant's relief was palpable. "Good, that's good," he cleared his throat. "It's nothing fancy, mind you, just folks from the surrounding area gathering to celebrate the harvest. There's music, dancing, food." "It sounds wonderful," Nora said sincerely. She couldn't remember the last time she'd attended any social event, let alone a dance. "Though I'm afraid I don't have anything suitable to wear. We can ride into town tomorrow. There's a dressmaker in Fort Gibson who could probably have something ready in time." He hesitated again. "Consider it a gift, for all your help with Illy and the ranch." Nora wanted to protest that she didn't need gifts, that the safe haven he'd provided was more than enough, but the hopeful look in his eyes stopped her. "Thank you. That's very generous." His smile warmed her more than the evening air. "It's settled then. We'll make a day of it. Head into town early, take care of some business I've been putting off, see about your dress." The trip to Fort Gibson the next day was a welcome break from the ranch routine. The town was larger than Muskogee, with several streets of businesses, a courthouse, and a small hotel. After seeing to his business at the bank and general store, Grant escorted Nora to the dressmaker's shop. Mrs. Abernathy, a plump woman with nimble fingers and an eye for fashion, clucked her tongue when Nora explained she needed a dress for the harvest dance in just a week's time. "Cutting it close, aren't you, dear? But for Grant Caldwell's lady, I'll make it work." She winked at Nora's blush. "Now, let me see. With your coloring, a deep blue would be lovely. I have just the fabric." As Mrs. Abernathy bustled about, pulling out bolts of cloth and pattern books, Nora glanced at Grant. He was standing awkwardly near the door, clearly out of his element among the ribbons and lace. "You don't have to wait," she told him. "This could take some time." He looked relieved. "I'll meet you at the hotel restaurant for lunch in an hour then. It's just down the street." After he left, Mrs. Abernathy became even more animated. "Such a fine man, Mr. Caldwell. Half the unmarried ladies in the county have set their caps for him over the years, but he never showed interest. Until now, it seems." She gave Nora a knowing look as she measured her waist. "We're just friends," Nora said, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. Hum. The older woman was clearly unconvinced. "Friends don't look at each other the way that man looks at you, my dear. Now, arms up so I can measure your bust." By the time Nora met Grant for lunch, she had been measured, pinned, and thoroughly interrogated about her relationship with that handsome rancher. She'd also selected a pattern and fabric for a dress that, according to Mrs. Abernathy, would make his eyes pop right out of his head. The lunch itself was pleasant, with Grant telling her more about Fort Gibson and its history as one of the first military posts in Indian Territory. Afterward, they visited a few more shops, with Grant insisting on buying her a pair of dress shoes and a small bottle of perfume to complement her new gown. "You don't have to do all this," Nora protested as they left the general store, her arms laden with packages. "I want to," he said simply. "You deserve nice things, Nora." The sincerity in his voice made her throat tight with emotion. No one had treated her with such consideration in years, not since her mother was alive. It was both wonderful and terrifying, opening up possibilities she'd long ago stopped allowing herself to imagine. The week leading up to the dance passed in a flurry of activity. There were still ranch chores to be done, meals to prepare, and Ali to look after, though he was now mobile enough to get around on crutches. On Thursday, Grant took Nora back to Fort Gibson for the final fitting of her dress, which Mrs. Abernathy had completed in record time. When she emerged from the fitting room wearing the finished gown, Grant's expression made every penny of his investment worthwhile. The dress was indeed the deep blue Mrs. Abernathy had recommended, with a fitted bodice that emphasized Nora's slender waist, and a full skirt that swished pleasantly when she moved. The neckline was modest but flattering, and the sleeves came to just below her elbows, trimmed with delicate lace. "You look." Grant seemed to be struggling for words, his eyes taking in every detail. "Beautiful doesn't seem adequate." Nora felt her cheeks warm at his obvious admiration. "Thank you. Mrs. Abernathy is a true artist." "The dress is lovely," the dressmaker agreed, preening a bit at the compliment, "but it's the woman wearing it that makes it shine." The night of the dance arrived clear and cool, with a harvest moon hanging low in the sky. Nora spent more time than usual on her appearance, arranging her hair in a style she remembered her mother wearing to special occasions, and dabbing a touch of the perfume Grant had bought her behind her ears and at her wrists. When she descended the stairs, Grant was waiting in the main room, dressed in what she assumed were his best clothes, a dark suit, crisp white shirt, and string tie. He'd trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair, and for a moment, Nora hardly recognized the polished gentleman before her as the same man who worked cattle and mended fences alongside his hands. "You clean up well, Mr. Caldwell," she said, trying to keep her voice light despite the fluttering in her stomach. His eyes traveled from her face to her gown and back again. "As do you, Miss Turner." He offered his arm. "Shall we?" The harvest dance was held in the community hall near the center of Fort Gibson. By the time they arrived, the celebration was in full swing, with a four-piece band playing lively tunes and couples twirling across the wooden floor. Tables laden with food lined one wall, and lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the proceedings. Nora recognized a few faces from her previous visits to town, and many more were unfamiliar. What she couldn't miss, however, were the curious glances directed their way as Grant led her into the hall, his hand at the small of her back. "Grant Caldwell, about time you showed your face at one of these affairs," called a portly man who Nora later learned was the mayor. "And with such charming company, too." For the next hour, Grant introduced her to what seemed like half the county: the blacksmith and his wife, the schoolteacher, the banker, countless farmers and ranchers with their families. Everyone was welcoming, though Nora caught more than one woman eyeing her with thinly veiled speculation. "Don't mind them," Mrs. Peterson said when she found Nora by the punch bowl after one such encounter. "They're just surprised to see Grant with anyone. He's kept to himself since his parents passed, focusing on the ranch to the exclusion of everything else." The widow patted Nora's arm. "It's good to see him smiling again." Before Nora could respond, the band struck up a waltz and Grant appeared at her side. "May I have this dance?" he asked, extending his hand. Though Nora had learned the basic steps of various dances in her youth, it had been years since she'd had occasion to use them. But as Grant led her onto the floor, one hand at her waist, the other clasping hers, the movements came back to her naturally. "I didn't know you could dance," she said as they moved in time to the music. "My mother insisted, said no son of hers would grow up to be a clumsy oaf at social functions." His grip tightened slightly as he guided her through a turn. "I haven't had much cause to use the skill lately." "Well, you haven't forgotten," Nora assured him, following his lead with ease. As the evening progressed, they danced several more times, took turns at the food table, and conversed with various townspeople. But throughout it all, Nora was acutely aware of Grant's presence: the warmth of his hand at her back, the way his eyes sought hers across the room, the sound of his laugh when something amused him. It was late when they finally left the dance, the moon high overhead, as Grant helped her into the buggy he'd borrowed for the occasion. The air had grown cooler, and he wrapped a blanket around her shoulders before taking his place beside her. "Did you enjoy yourself?" he asked as they set off down the road toward the ranch. "Very much." Nora smiled, still feeling the pleasant exhaustion that comes from dancing and good company. "Thank you for bringing me. Thank you for coming." He glanced at her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "I haven't enjoyed an evening so much in years." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves and the occasional night bird calling. Nora felt a sense of contentment that went beyond the pleasure of the dance. Being with Grant, she realized, brought her a piece she hadn't known she was missing. "Nora," Grant said suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet, "there's something I've been wanting to talk to you about." Her heart quickened at his tone. "Yes." He slowed the horse, then brought the buggy to a complete stop at a spot where the road widened, overlooking a small valley bathed in moonlight. Securing the reins, he turned to face her. "When I bought your contract from Warner, I had no intention beyond giving you your freedom. I wanted you to have choices, to decide your own path." He paused, his eyes searching hers. But these past months, having you at the ranch, getting to know you, it's changed things, changed me." Nora's breath caught in her throat. "How so?" "I find myself thinking about you when you're not there. Watching for you when I ride in at the end of the day, wondering what makes you smile, what troubles you." He took her hand, his touch gentle. "I've come to care for you, Nora, more than I thought possible." Joy bloomed in her chest, warm and bright. "I feel the same way," she admitted softly. "I've tried to tell myself it was just gratitude, but it's more than that. Much more." Grant's expression lightened, hope replacing the uncertainty that had been there moments before. "I don't want you to feel obligated in any way because of our arrangement. If you need more time or if your feelings change, they won't," Nora interrupted, surprising herself with her certainty. "I know my own mind, Grant, and my heart." Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned closer. When his lips met hers, the kiss was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand. Nora answered by sliding her hand to the back of his neck, drawing him nearer. The kiss deepened, becoming something more urgent, more powerful than either of them had anticipated. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily, their foreheads touching as they tried to regain their composure. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," Grant confessed, his voice rough with emotion. Nora smiled, her heart fuller than she could ever remember it being. "What took you so long?" His laugh was soft, intimate. "Fear, I suppose. Fear that you wouldn't feel the same, that it was too soon, that I was taking advantage of your situation." "You've never taken advantage," she assured him, touching his face gently. "From the moment we met, you've given me choices. That's a gift I can never repay." "I don't want repayment, Nora. I just want you in my life, by my side, for as long as you'll have me." The words hung between them, not quite a proposal but more than a simple declaration. Nora knew that Grant, true to form, was giving her yet another choice to define what their relationship would be, to set the pace of its development. "I want that too," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her. "I want to be with you, Grant. To build something lasting, something real." His smile then was like the sunrise, full of promise and joy. He kissed her again, more confidently this time, and Nora felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. When they finally continued their journey home, something had shifted between them, a new understanding, a shared future beginning to take shape. Grant held the reins with one hand, the other clasping Nora's beneath the blanket. Their fingers intertwined as naturally as if they'd been holding hands for years. The ranch was quiet when they arrived, the bunkhouse dark, only a single lamp burning in the main house where Thomas had left it for their return. As Grant helped Nora down from the buggy, he held her a moment longer than necessary, reluctant to let the evening end. "I should see to the horse," he said finally, though he made no move to step away. "And I should check on Ollie," Nora replied, equally hesitant. Grant leaned in for one more kiss, brief but full of promise. "Good night, Nora." "Good night, Grant." As she made her way inside, Nora touched her fingers to her lips, still feeling the warmth of his kiss. For the first time since her father's death, no, longer than that, since before her mother died, she felt truly hopeful about the future. The weeks following the harvest dance were the happiest of Nora's life. Her relationship with Grant blossomed openly, no longer constrained by uncertainty or hesitation. They still maintained proper decorum, especially in front of the ranch hands, but there was no hiding the affection between them. October brought cooler weather and the final preparations for winter. The cattle were moved to sheltered pastures, hay was stored in the barn, and the house was made ready for the cold months ahead. Nora threw herself into these tasks with enthusiasm, taking pride in her contributions to the ranch's operations. Grant, meanwhile, seemed to walk with a new lightness in his step. The serious, sometimes somber rancher who had first brought her to the Circle C had given way to a man who smiled more readily, laughed more often, and found reasons to touch her whenever they were near a hand at the small of her back, fingers brushing as they passed tools or dishes, a kiss stolen when no one was looking. Ellie's recovery continued steadily, and by the end of the month he was able to get around with just a cane. Though he couldn't yet ride or handle the more strenuous ranch work, he took on light duties around the barn and house, eager to contribute. "Never thought I'd be so happy to muck out stalls," he told Nora one afternoon as she brought him lunch in the barn. "Sitting around all day was driving me crazy." "Well, don't overdo it," she cautioned, handing him a sandwich and a cup of coffee. "Dr. Porter said the bone still needs time to strengthen," Ellie nodded, taking a bite of the sandwich. "The boss says the same thing every morning. Between the two of you, I'm the most looked after invalid in the territory," he grinned. "Not that I'm complaining. It's nice, having someone care." Nora understood what he meant. After years of feeling alone, of struggling to make her way in a world that often seemed indifferent to her existence, being part of this small community, this family, almost was a gift beyond measure. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Nora shared these thoughts with Grant. "I never expected to find this," she said, her head resting against his shoulder. "A place where I belong." Grant's arm tightened around her. "You belong here, Nora, with me." He hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking about the future, our future." She looked up at him, heart quickening. "Oh, I love you," he said simply, the words falling naturally from his lips as if he'd been saying them all along. "I think I've loved you since that first night on the trail, when you told me about your father and didn't shed a tear, even though I could see how much it hurt you to talk about him." Nora's eyes filled with the tears she hadn't allowed herself then. "I love you too, Grant. So much it frightens me sometimes." He brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "What frightens you? How quickly it happened. How completely. I've always prided myself on being practical, level-headed, but with you, my heart took over before my head had a chance to catch up." Grant smiled, understanding in his eyes. "That's how it's supposed to be, I think, when it's right." He took a deep breath. "Which brings me to what I wanted to ask you." Reaching into his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box. Nora's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a ring, a delicate gold band set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "It was my mother's," Grant explained, his voice husky with emotion. "My father gave it to her when he proposed. She told me once that the pearl represented the treasure he'd found in her." Nora couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the moment and its meaning. "Nora Turner," Grant continued, taking her hand, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Of building a life with me here, sharing the good days and the hard ones, growing old together on this land that's become as much yours as mine." Through her tears, Nora managed to find her voice. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Grant, I will marry you." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger, where it fit as if it had been made for her. When he kissed her, it was with a tenderness that spoke of promises kept and a future assured. The news of their engagement spread quickly, first among the ranch hands who responded with hearty congratulations and knowing smiles, and then to the wider community. Letters and small gifts arrived from neighbors and townsfolk, along with invitations to dinners and gatherings where Nora was warmly welcomed as Grant's future wife. Mrs. Peterson visited the ranch as soon as she heard, bringing a quilt she'd been working on, for just such an occasion. Her approval was evident in the way she hugged Nora and whispered, "I knew at the moment I saw you two together. Some things are simply meant to be." They set the wedding date for the first Saturday in December, giving them time to prepare but not so long that they'd have to wait through the worst of winter. The ceremony would be held at the small church in Fort Gibson, with a celebration afterward at the ranch. As the weeks passed and their wedding day approached, Nora found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. From the desperate young woman bound by a contract to a violent man, to the bride-to-be of a man whose kindness and integrity had healed wounds she hadn't known were still bleeding, it seemed almost too much good fortune for one lifetime. "What are you thinking about so intently?" Grant asked one evening as they sat by the fire, going over plans for the wedding. Nora looked up from the list she'd been pretending to study. "How different my life might have been if you hadn't come to Muskogee that day, if you hadn't heard about my situation, or decided to help." Grant set down the ledger he'd been reviewing. "I believe some things are fated, Nora. Not everything we make our own choices, forge our own paths. But sometimes two paths are meant to cross. Ours were." "You really believe that?" "I do." He reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over the pearl ring that now adorned it. "How else do you explain the chain of events that brought you to me? Out of all the saloons in all the towns in the territory, I walked into that one on that particular night." Nora smiled at his reasoning. "When you put it that way, it does sound like more than coincidence. Fate, providence, luck, whatever you call it, I'm grateful for it." He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. "And I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret the choice you made to stay." "I could never regret it," she assured him. "Even on days when you're being particularly stubborn." That made him laugh. "Me? Stubborn? I think you have that backward, Miss Turner." Their playful argument was interrupted by a knock at the door. Grant rose to answer it, returning moments later with Thomas, whose serious expression immediately put Nora on alert. "What is it?" Grant asked, clearly sensing the same tension. Thomas removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "Ryder just came through from Fort Gibson. Thought you should know Silas Warner's been seen in town." Nora felt the blood drain from her face. "Warner? Here." "Not here at the ranch," Thomas clarified quickly. "In Fort Gibson. Apparently he's been asking questions about you, about both of you." Grant's expression hardened. "Did the rider say what kind of questions?" "Just that Warner seemed mighty interested in where Miss Turner had ended up, and when he heard she was here with you." Thomas trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "He wasn't pleased," Nora finished for him, a chill running down her spine despite the warmth of the fire. Grant moved to her side, his hand finding hers. "Thank you for letting us know, Thomas. Double the night watch for the next few days just as a precaution." After Thomas left, Nora turned to Grant, fear clawing at her throat. "What does he want?" "The contract is void. You tore it up." "I don't know," Grant admitted, his jaw tight with concern. "But whatever it is, he won't get near you, I promise you that." Despite his reassurance, sleep eluded Nora that night. She lay awake, remembering Silas Warner's cruel eyes, his heavy hands, the way he'd treated her like property rather than a person. What could he possibly want now, months after she'd left Muskogee? Her answer came 3 days later, in the form of a letter delivered by a nervous-looking boy from Fort Gibson. Nora was alone in the house when it arrived. Grant and the hands out checking on a section of fence reported to be down after a storm the previous night. The letter, addressed to her in an unfamiliar hand, contained just a few lines. "Miss Turner, your debt to me remains unpaid. The contract may be gone, but what you owe is not. Meet me at the abandoned Miller place tomorrow at noon to discuss terms, or I will be forced to take more direct action. S." Warner. Nora's hands trembled as she read the words. The Miller place was an old homestead about 5 miles from the Circle C, abandoned years ago when the family moved west to California. It was isolated, the perfect spot for an ambush or worse. Her first instinct was to wait for Grant, to show him the letter and let him handle Warner. But what if that was exactly what Warner wanted? To draw Grant into a confrontation, perhaps even a gunfight. Grant was skilled with a rifle for hunting, but he was no gunslinger. Warner, from what she'd heard in Muskogee, had killed more than one man in self-defense. No, she couldn't risk Grant's life, and she couldn't continue to live in fear of Silas Warner appearing to destroy the happiness she'd found. There had to be another way. By the time Grant returned late that afternoon, Nora had made her decision. She hid the letter in her dresser drawer and said nothing about it, though her silence weighed heavily on her as they ate dinner and discussed plans for the next day. "I need to ride into town tomorrow," Grant told her as they cleared the table. "The wedding rings should be ready at the jeweler's, and I want to speak with the minister about the ceremony." Nora nodded, guilt twisting in her stomach. "What time will you be back?" "Mid-afternoon, most likely." "Unless there's something you need me to bring back." "No, nothing." She forced a smile. "Everything's perfect." That night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, Grant sensed her preoccupation. "Something's troubling you," he said, not a question but a statement of fact. "Is it Warner? Are you worried about him showing up at the wedding?" Nora hesitated, torn between honesty and protection. "A little," she admitted. "But mostly I'm just overwhelmed by everything. The wedding preparations, becoming a rancher's wife, starting a new chapter." Grant studied her face in the lantern light. "If you want to postpone, we can. There's no rush." "No." The word came out more forcefully than she'd intended. "No, I don't want to wait. I want to be your wife, Grant, as soon as possible." Seemingly reassured by her vehemence, he smiled. "That's good to hear, because I'm not sure I could stand the waiting much longer." Nora's heart ached with love for him, making her resolution even stronger. Tomorrow, she would end the threat Silas Warner posed to their future, one way or another. The next morning, she rose early and prepared breakfast as usual. Grant left for town shortly after, pressing a kiss to her forehead and promising to be back by 3. As soon as he was out of sight, Nora changed into her riding clothes and made her way to the barn. Thomas was there, saddling a horse for his own day's work. "Morning, Miss Turner. Planning to ride today?" "Just a short one," she said, keeping her voice casual as she prepared her mare. "I've been cooped up with wedding plans, and it's such a beautiful day." He nodded approvingly. "It is at that. Don't go too far, though. The boss wouldn't like you riding alone, especially with Warner possibly in the area." "I'll stay close to the house," she promised, the lie bitter on her tongue. As soon as Thomas rode out in the opposite direction, Nora mounted her horse and set off toward the Miller place. She had tucked a small derringer, a gift from Grant, for emergencies, into the pocket of her jacket. She hoped she wouldn't need to use it, but the weight of it was reassuring nonetheless. The abandoned homestead came into view just before noon, a weathered cabin and barn standing in a small clearing, the fields around it reclaimed by nature. There was no sign of Warner or anyone else as Nora approached cautiously. She dismounted near the cabin, tying her horse to a post that had once supported a porch railing. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, opening with a creak when she pushed it. The interior was dim, dust motes dancing in the few shafts of sunlight that penetrated the boarded-up windows. Nora stepped inside, her hand moving to the pocket where the derringer rested. "Warner," she called, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm here as you asked." For a moment, there was only silence. Then a shadow detached itself from the far corner of the room, and Silas Warner stepped into a beam of light. He looked much as she remembered, heavyset, with small, calculating eyes and a mouth that seemed perpetually twisted into a sneer. But there was something different too, a haggard quality that hadn't been there before. "Miss Turner," he said, his voice a familiar drawl that still made her skin crawl. "How kind of you to accept my invitation." Nora kept her distance, watching him warily. "What do you want, Warner?" "What's rightfully mine." He moved closer, and she could smell the whiskey on him. "You still owe me, girl. That debt didn't disappear just because Caldwell tore up a piece of paper." "I owed you nothing then, and I owe you nothing now," Nora replied, her hand closing around the derringer. "My father's debt was paid when Grant bought the contract." Warner laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the empty cabin. "Caldwell paid me a fraction of what you're worth, what you could earn for me." Disgust rose in Nora's throat. "I am not property to be bought and sold. And I am not afraid of you anymore." "No," Warner's eyes narrowed. "Maybe you should be. Maybe your precious rancher should be too. Accidents happen all the time out here. A man falls from his horse, gets caught in a stampede." The threat against Grant sparked a fury in Nora that pushed aside her fear. "If you go anywhere near him, I swear You'll what?" Warner interrupted, taking another step toward her. "Shoot me. I don't think you have it in you, girl." Nora drew the derringer from her pocket, pointing it steadily at his chest. "You're wrong about that. I've changed since Muskogee." Warner stopped, eyeing the small gun with surprise that quickly turned to amusement. "That little pea-shooter. Even if you had the courage to pull the trigger, it'd barely slow me down." "It would slow you down enough," came a new voice from the doorway. Nora's heart lurched as Grant stepped into the cabin, his rifle trained on Warner. Behind him, she could see Thomas and Joe, similarly armed. Warner's expression darkened as he realized he was outnumbered and outgunned. "This is between me and the girl, Caldwell, a business matter." "Nora is going to be my wife," Grant said, his voice deadly calm, "which makes this very much my business." "Your wife?" Warner's laugh held no humor. "Does she know about your sister, about how you failed to save her?" Nora saw Grant flinch almost imperceptibly, but his aim remained steady. "Grace has nothing to do with this." "Doesn't she?" Warner sneered. "Is that why you rescued Miss Turner here? Trying to make up for letting your sister die in a place like mine?" For a horrible moment, Nora thought Grant might pull the trigger. The look on his face was one she'd never seen before, raw pain mingled with a rage so profound it transformed his features. "Grant," she said softly, drawing his attention away from Warner. "He's not worth it." The moment stretched, taut as a bowstring. Then something in Grant's expression shifted, the rage receding, control reasserting itself. "You're right," he said, lowering the rifle slightly. "He's not." To Warner, he added, "You're going to walk out of here, get on your horse and ride away. You're going to leave the territory and never come back. Because if I ever see you again, if I even hear rumors that you're within 100 miles of here, I won't be so merciful." Warner's eyes darted between Grant and the men behind him, calculating his odds. Finally, he raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Fine. I know when I'm beaten, but this isn't over, not really." His gaze settled on Nora. "Remember that, girl. Nothing's ever really over." Grant stepped aside to let Warner pass, his rifle still at the ready. Thomas and Joe flanked the door, watching carefully as Warner exited the cabin and mounted a horse tethered nearby. Only when he'd ridden well out of sight did the tension in the air begin to dissipate. Nora sagged against the wall, the derringer dropping from her suddenly nerveless fingers. Grant was beside her in an instant, his arms encircling her, holding her upright. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. "Did he hurt you?" She shook her head, burying her face against his chest. "No, I'm fine, just shaken." Grant turned to Thomas and Joe. "Follow him. Make sure he leaves the territory." The men nodded and departed, leaving Grant and Nora alone in the dusty cabin. For a long moment, neither spoke. Nora could feel Grant's heart pounding beneath her cheek, a rhythm that gradually slowed as the immediate danger passed. "How did you know?" she asked finally, pulling back to look at him. "About the letter, about me coming here." "I didn't at first," Grant admitted. "I went to town as planned. But something about your behavior last night bothered me. You seemed off. When I mentioned Warner, you got defensive. So before I left this morning, I checked your room." He looked slightly abashed at this admission. "I found the letter in your drawer. You went through my things." Nora wasn't sure whether to be angry or relieved. "I was worried," Grant said simply. "And it turns out I had reason to be." "What were you thinking, Nora, coming here alone to face him?" Now that the danger had passed, the full recklessness of her actions hit her. "I was trying to protect you," she said, tears springing to her eyes. "He threatened you in the letter. I couldn't bear the thought of him hurting you because of me." Grant's expression softened, his hands framing her face. "Don't you understand? That's exactly how I feel about you." The thought of him getting his hands on you again. He couldn't finish, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry," Nora whispered. "I should have told you about the letter right away." "Yes, you should have." He rested his forehead against hers. "We're going to be partners, Nora, in everything. That means no secrets, no facing dangers alone. Promise me." "I promise," she said solemnly. "No more secrets." He kissed her then, a kiss that spoke of relief and love and the terrifying knowledge of how close they'd come to losing each other. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "Let's go home," Grant said, taking her hand. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them processing the events of the morning. Nora couldn't help but think about what Warner had said about Grant's sister. She wanted to ask, to understand what had happened, but wasn't sure if now was the right time. As if reading her thoughts, Grant spoke. "What Warner said about Grace, it wasn't entirely untrue." Nora glanced at him, surprised by his voluntary mention of the painful subject. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to." "I think I do." He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "After our parents died, Grace struggled. She was young, grieving. I was focused on saving the ranch, working all hours. I didn't see what was happening until it was too late." He paused, the memory clearly painful. "She fell in with bad company, ended up working in a saloon in Dodge City. By the time I tracked her down, she was trapped by debt by a man like Warner." "What happened?" Nora asked gently when he fell silent. "I tried to buy her freedom like I did yours. But the man who held her contract refused to sell, said she was too valuable." Grant's hands tightened on the reins. "I left to gather more money, thinking I could change his mind with a higher offer. When I returned 3 days later, she was gone. They told me she'd run away, but later I learned the truth. She'd taken her own life rather than continue in that place." Nora's heart broke for him, for the young man who had lost his sister in such a tragic way. "Grant, I'm so sorry. For years I blamed myself," he continued, his voice steadier now. "If I'd been more attentive after our parents died, if I'd found her sooner, if I'd never left her side once I did find her, maybe she'd still be alive." "It wasn't your fault," Nora said firmly. "You did everything you could." "That's what I tell myself now, but the guilt never quite goes away." He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and love. "When I heard about you from that bartender in Muskogee, something just clicked. I couldn't save Grace, but maybe I could save you." "You did save me," Nora said, reaching across to touch his arm. "But not just from Warner, from a life without hope, without love." A small smile touched his lips. "You saved me too, Nora, from becoming a bitter, lonely man who cared more for his cattle than for people." By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in vivid streaks of orange and pink. They dismounted in the yard, both weary from the emotional day. "What about Warner?" Nora asked as Grant took care of the horses. "Do you think he'll stay away?" Grant considered the question seriously. "I believe so. Men like him are cowards at heart. They prey on those they perceive as weak, not those who stand up to them." He stroked her mare's neck. "And if he doesn't, we'll face him together, as we will all challenges that come our way." That night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, a sense of peace settled over Nora. Warner was gone, the threat he posed diminished if not entirely eliminated. In 10 days she would marry Grant, becoming his wife and true partner in all things. The future stretched before them, full of promise. "What are you thinking?" Grant asked, his arm around her shoulders. Nora leaned into him, content in a way she'd never thought possible. "That I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." The day of the wedding dawned clear and cold, a perfect December morning with frost glittering on the grass and a pale blue sky overhead. Nora woke early, too excited to sleep, and watched the sunrise from her window, the last sunrise she would see as Nora Turner. By day's end, she would be Nora Caldwell, Grant's wife, mistress of the Circle C Ranch. Mrs. Peterson arrived mid-morning to help her prepare, bringing with her a beautiful lace veil that had been her own mother's. "Something borrowed," she said as she carefully pinned it to Nora's hair, which had been arranged in an elegant updo. "And something old, too, I suppose." The dress was new, a creation of Mrs. Abernathy's that had required 3 fittings and more money than Nora had ever spent on clothing in her life. But as she stood before the mirror, the ivory silk and delicate lace transforming her into a bride, she couldn't regret a penny of it. "You look beautiful, dear Mrs. Peterson said, her eyes misty. "Grant won't be able to take his eyes off you." Nora smiled, touching the pearl ring on her finger, her something blue in the form of the tiny sapphires that flanked the central pearl. "I hope so." They traveled to Fort Gibson in a buggy decorated with ribbons and winter greenery, Thomas serving as driver and self-appointed bodyguard, though there had been no sign of Warner since the confrontation at the Miller place. The church was filled when they arrived, friends from town, neighboring ranchers and farmers, even some of Grant's business associates from as far away as St. Louis. Nora felt a moment of panic at the size of the crowd, but it dissipated as soon as the music began, and she stepped into the church on Thomas's arm. Grant waited at the altar, handsome in a new black suit, his expression transforming from nervousness to awe as he saw her for the first time. The look in his eyes as she walked toward him, love, pride, wonder, was one Nora knew she would remember until her dying day. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. Nora was aware of the minister's words, of Grant's hand warm in hers, of the ring being slipped onto her finger to join her engagement ring. But mostly, she was aware of Grant, his steady presence beside her, his voice clear and sure as he spoke his vows, the love radiating from him like heat from a stove on a winter's night. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister said finally. "You may kiss the bride." Grant's kiss was tender, respectful of their surroundings, but with an undercurrent of promise that made Nora's heart race. As they turned to face their guests, now officially Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell, the church erupted in applause. The celebration at the ranch afterward was everything they had hoped for: joyous, warm, filled with good food, music, and the company of friends. The main room of the house had been transformed, with tables laden with food prepared by the women of the community, garlands of evergreens and holly decorating the walls, and lanterns casting a golden glow over everything. As the evening progressed, Nora found moments to observe her new husband as he moved among their guests, laughing with the ranch hands, discussing cattle prices with neighboring ranchers, thanking everyone for coming to share in their special day. He caught her watching once and crossed the room to her side, taking her hand in his. "Happy, Mrs. Caldwell?" he asked, his smile causing her heart to flutter even after all these months. "Completely," she assured him, leaning into his side. "And you, more than I ever thought possible." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Although I will be happier still when everyone leaves and I have you to myself." Nora felt her cheeks warm at his implication, but she couldn't disagree. As wonderful as the celebration was, a part of her was counting the minutes until they would be alone. Finally, as the night grew late, guests began to depart, each stopping to congratulate the newlyweds one final time. Mrs. Peterson was the last to leave, hugging Nora tightly. "Be happy, my dear," she whispered. "You both deserve it." When the house was quiet at last, Grant locked the door and turned to Nora, his expression a mixture of love and desire that made her breath catch. "Alone at last," he said, closing the distance between them. "Alone at last," she echoed, meeting him halfway. His kiss this time was different from any they had shared before, deeper, more urgent, unrestrained by the presence of others or the constraints of propriety. Nora responded in kind, her arms winding around his neck, her body pressing closer to his. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily, their eyes dark with wanting. "Shall we retire, Mrs. Caldwell?" Grant asked, his voice husky. Nora nodded, suddenly shy despite the months of anticipation. Grant seemed to understand, taking her hand gently and leading her upstairs to what was now their shared bedroom, his room, the master's suite at the front of the house, with its large bed and windows that caught the morning sun. What followed was a night of discovery and connection, of learning each other in the most intimate ways. Grant was tender, patient, ensuring Nora's comfort and pleasure before his own. And Nora, despite her initial nervousness, found herself responding to his touch with an ardor that surprised and delighted them both. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the quiet darkness, Nora felt a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "What is it, love?" Grant asked, feeling the dampness on her cheek. "Did I hurt you?" "No," she assured him, nestling closer. "These are happy tears. I never thought I could feel this way, so complete." He tightened his arms around her, pressing a kiss to her hair. "I know exactly what you mean." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, the first night of many they would share as husband and wife. The months that followed their wedding were filled with the everyday joys and challenges of married life. Winter gave way to spring, bringing new calves to the herd and fresh growth to the land. Nora, now fully embracing her role as Mrs. Caldwell, managed the household with efficiency and warmth, making the ranch house truly a home. Grant, for his part, seemed to thrive with Nora by his side. The ranch prospered under their joint stewardship, with Grant handling the cattle and business aspects, while Nora contributed her practical knowledge and unwavering support. They made decisions together, faced difficulties as a team, and celebrated successes as partners in the truest sense. Their love, too, deepened with time. The passion of their wedding night didn't diminish but rather grew richer, more nuanced as they learned each other's bodies and hearts more thoroughly. Their days were filled with work and responsibility, but their nights belonged to them alone, a sacred time of connection and intimacy. When spring turned to summer, Nora began to suspect what the persistent morning illness and sudden aversions to certain foods might mean. A visit to Doc Porter confirmed her suspicions. She was with child, due to deliver in the early winter. Grant's reaction to the news was everything she could have hoped for: joy, wonder, and a fierce protectiveness that manifested in his insistence that she rest more and let others take on some of her duties. "I'm pregnant," Not invalid, she reminded him more than once, though she secretly cherished his concern. Humor me, he would reply with that smile that still made her heart skip a beat. It's my first time being a father. As her body changed, growing round with their child, Nora found herself reflecting often on the journey that had brought her to this point. From the desperate young woman trapped by Silas Warner's contract to the beloved wife, and soon to be mother, she was now the transformation seemed almost miraculous. She shared these thoughts with Grant one evening as they sat on the porch, his hand resting on her swollen belly where their child kicked and rolled. "You ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" she asked. "If you hadn't come to Muskogee that day, if you hadn't heard about me from that bartender." "I try not to," Grant admitted, his eyes serious. "The thought of you in Warner's power, of never knowing you, never having this life with you." He shook his head. "It's too painful to contemplate." "I'm glad you found me," Nora said simply, covering his hand with hers. "I'm glad you chose to stay," he countered. "That was the real turning point, you know, not me buying your contract, but you deciding to make a life here." Nora smiled, remembering the uncertainty of those early days. "It wasn't much of a decision, really. I think my heart knew before my head did that this was where I belonged." Their son was born on a cold January night, arriving after a long labor that tested Nora's strength and Grant's composure. But when the midwife placed the squalling infant in Nora's arms, all the pain and exhaustion seemed to vanish. "He's perfect," Grant whispered, perched on the edge of the bed, his finger caught in his son's tiny fist. "Absolutely perfect." They named him James Thomas Caldwell, James after Grant's father, Thomas after the foreman who had become family to them both. He had Grant's eyes and Nora's determination, apparent from his first moments in the world. "He's going to be stubborn like his mother," Grant predicted as their son refused to sleep one night, his cries echoing through the house. "And headstrong, like his father," Nora countered, hiding a smile as Grant paced the floor with the baby, attempting to soothe him with an off-key rendition of a lullaby. Parenthood brought new challenges and deeper joys to their marriage. Sleepless nights gave way to first smiles, first words, first steps. James grew from a helpless infant to a curious toddler, his personality emerging more clearly with each passing day. And through it all, Grant and Nora's love for each other remained the foundation of their family, a constant in the ever-changing landscape of their lives. On the morning of their 5th wedding anniversary, Grant surprised Nora with breakfast in bed, a luxury rarely afforded to the mother of an active 3-year-old and his 1-year-old sister, Elizabeth Grace, named for both their mothers. "Happy anniversary, Mrs. Caldwell," he said, setting the tray across her lap before sitting beside her on the bed. Nora smiled, touched by his thoughtfulness. "Happy anniversary. Where are the children?" "With Thomas and his wife. They're taking them for the day so we can have some time alone." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch still sending shivers down her spine after all these years. "I thought we could ride out to that spot by the creek, have a picnic, like we used to before the children came along." "That sounds wonderful," Nora agreed, leaning in for a kiss that quickly deepened. The breakfast grew cold as they rediscovered the passion that had never truly waned, only been tempered by the responsibilities of parenthood and running the ranch. When they finally rose and dressed, the morning was half gone, but neither of them minded. They rode out together under a clear blue sky, the land around them transformed by the years of care and investment. The Circle C had grown with new pastures added, the herd doubled in size, and the buildings improved and expanded. It was no longer just Grant's inheritance, but their shared creation, a legacy they were building together. At the creek, In a secluded spot where willows dipped their branches into the water, they spread a blanket and unpacked the lunch Nora had prepared. As they ate and talked, reminiscing about their years together, Nora felt a sense of gratitude so profound it almost overwhelmed her. "What is it?" Grant asked, noticing the tears that suddenly shimmered in her eyes. "I was just thinking about all we have," she said, gesturing to the land around them, but meaning so much more: their children, their home, their love. "And how close I came to having none of it." Grant took her hand, bringing it to his lips. "But you do have it, Nora. We both do." "Because of you," she said softly. "Because you gave me a choice when I thought I had none." "No," he corrected gently. "Because you were brave enough to take that choice to build a life here with me." He pulled her into his arms, his voice husky with emotion. "Every day I thank whatever providence brought you to me. Every day I try to be worthy of the trust you placed in me." "You are," Nora assured him, cradling his face in her hands. "You always have been." As they kissed, the creek burbling beside them and the sun warm on their faces, Nora knew with absolute certainty that this was where she was meant to be. Not just on this land in this moment, but in this life as Grant's wife, as mother to their children, as mistress of the Circle C. From a desperate contract that had nearly condemned her to a life of exploitation, she had found freedom, love, and a future brighter than anything she could have imagined. All because one man had been kind enough, brave enough to offer her a choice, and she had been wise enough to choose him.